I stayed silent until my friend's older sister leaned in and said, "Say something." That one sentence changed everything. The first time I noticed her, I didn't even know her name. My friend's older sister was in the room, moving with an effortless grace that made her seem larger than the space around her. I, on the other hand, was shrinking into the couch, trying to blend into the background, convinced that my 20-something awkwardness would somehow betray me if I drew attention to myself. I had stayed quiet all evening, quietly observing the conversations around me, occasionally chiming in with a joke, but mostly letting the adults talk. She didn't speak to me at first. She was laughing softly with my friend, leaning slightly forward with that confident poise only someone who's lived decades could carry. Even in the dim glow of the overhead lights, there was something magnetic about her presence. It wasn't just beauty. It was the calm assurance in her movements, the small, almost imperceptible gestures, the way her fingers wrapped around her cup as if she belonged there completely. I found myself noticing every detail, the slight curl of her hair catching the light, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the subtle warmth of her voice that reached me even across the room. I wanted to say something, anything, but my tongue felt like lead, and my thoughts scattered the moment I imagined her looking directly at me. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, fascinated, as though I could somehow memorize every motion, every little habit, just by observing. The social rules around us, her being older, my being young, my friend watching, made the situation feel forbidden yet thrilling. I didn't want to break the spell by speaking too soon. Then it happened, a glance, a simple look, and suddenly my world narrowed to her alone. She wasn't staring in a demanding way, just curious, playful, like she had noticed my quietness and was silently challenging me. My heart jumped. It was absurd how much impact a few seconds could have. I caught myself adjusting my posture, trying not to fidget, and yet I couldn't help but feel drawn closer to her energy. Even though I hadn't spoken a word, there was a warmth in the air I couldn't explain. The faint aroma of her perfume mingled with the coffee on the table, and I realized I was aware of every tiny detail. The way she tilted her head as she listened to someone else speak, the soft rustle of her sweater, the subtle movement of her hand on the edge of the chair. I was mesmerized, trapped in a quiet fascination that both excited and terrified me. And in that moment, I knew something had shifted. I had always thought I could hide behind my silence, observing from the sidelines, but her presence made me feel exposed in the best possible way. My curiosity wasn't just casual. It was something that tingled beneath the skin, a spark that insisted I pay attention. I didn't speak that night, but I didn't need to. The glance, the small gestures, the mere fact that she was there, it was enough to set the stage. And deep down, I knew this quiet curiosity was the first step toward something that would completely change the way I thought about her, and maybe even myself. It happened sooner than I expected. One quiet evening, my friend had stepped away to make a phone call, leaving the two of us alone in the living room. I had been trying, with only moderate success, to blend into the background, convinced that speaking would make me look foolish. But then she leaned in, her voice low and deliberate, almost teasing, "Say something." I froze. My brain short-circuited in that instant. I could feel the weight of her gaze on me, steady and patient, as if she were daring me to respond. It was equal parts intimidating and exhilarating. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, swallowed, and tried to think of something clever or funny, anything that could break the silence without revealing how flustered I actually felt. I started, my voice betraying more hesitation than I wanted. I laughed nervously, and she tilted her head slightly, a faint smile playing on her lips, encouraging me without saying a word. That tiny gesture, the curve of her smile, the warmth in her eyes, made me feel like I wasn't just fumbling in front of someone beautiful. I was fumbling in front of someone who genuinely wanted to hear me. Finally, I managed a weak joke about something trivial my friend had said earlier. She chuckled softly, not just politely but fully, as if my awkward humor had genuinely amused her. And just like that, the air between us shifted. The silence that had felt heavy moments before now felt charged with possibility. My nervousness melted slightly, replaced with a thrilling awareness. She was noticing me. She was present with me. I realized then how deliberate she was, how intentional her attention felt. The subtle way she leaned slightly forward, the gentle way her hand brushed against the book she was holding, the soft warmth of her presence. It all seemed to pull me in closer, even as I tried to stay composed. Every nerve in my body felt alive, every glance and pause magnified. There was no pressure in her approach, no rush to move forward, just a quiet, intimate challenge. Meet her halfway. I noticed the small details I hadn't before, the way her fingers lightly drummed on the edge of the table when she was thinking, the faint fragrance of her perfume lingering in the air between us, the way her eyes softened when she laughed at my awkward joke. By the time my friend returned, I was acutely aware of the subtle connection we had formed in those few minutes. It wasn't a grand confession or a dramatic moment, but a spark had been lit, quiet and steady, just enough to make me wonder what it might grow into. Walking away, I realized something important. She had seen me in a way no one else had that night. Not the quiet, reserved version of myself I showed to the world, but the real, fumbling, trying to be clever version. And I needed to be seen by her again. That evening, I left with a quiet awareness that something had shifted. It was no longer mere curiosity. Something deeper had begun. A connection forged in stillness, small gestures, and unspoken invitation. A spark that promised the slow burn of something unforgettable. After that first spark, I couldn't stop noticing her. She became impossible to ignore, even in the most ordinary moments. Every time I entered a room, my eyes seemed drawn to her without permission. It wasn't just her beauty. It was the quiet confidence she carried. The way she moved through the world as though every gesture mattered, even the smallest ones. I was fascinated, and yet I was painfully aware of the gulf between us. Her life experience, her age, the social rules I didn't quite know how to navigate. Started small. Casual group gatherings, short conversations where my attempts at humor were met with that knowing smile. Sometimes she would make small allowances for me, letting me finish a sentence, giving me the benefit of the doubt when I stumbled over a thought. Other times, her attention seemed almost teasing, lingering a moment too long on my eyes, brushing against my hand accidentally. Or so I convinced myself. Every gesture became a question I wasn't ready to answer. I found myself analyzing her in silence, noting the rhythm of her speech, the tilt of her head, the way her laughter softened her features and made her seem younger, more approachable. And yet I hesitated. Every time I thought about moving closer, saying something meaningful, I felt the pull of hesitation. The age difference, the fear of judgment, the uncertainty of whether she could feel anything beyond casual amusement for someone half her age. And then there were the small, unintentional touches. The brief hand on my shoulder as she guided me past an obstacle, the light brush of her fingers as she handed me a cup, the warmth that lingered in the space where her presence met mine. Each moment was fleeting, ordinary in isolation, yet together they created a weight I could not ignore. My curiosity had become something more, a quiet fascination that tugged at my chest every time she was near. Her presence made me hyper-aware of myself in a way I had never experienced before. I noticed the clumsiness in my own movements, the way my pulse quickened when she looked at me, the slight tremor in my voice when I tried to respond. At the same time, I observed her carefully, wondering if she noticed the same things. The nervous twitch of my hands, the way I hesitated when speaking, the subtle longing in my eyes. I realized that fascination and fear were intertwined. I wanted to reach out, to speak to her more, to share thoughts that had never left my mind before. But every time I tried, the invisible barrier of social expectation, age difference, and self-consciousness pushed me back. I was caught between wanting to move closer and wanting to stay invisible. And yet, she made it so hard to stay hidden. Her subtle gestures, the warmth of her glance, the quiet confidence she carried. It all whispered possibilities. She wasn't just present. She was inviting me to notice her, to participate in a connection that I could neither define nor fully resist. And slowly, quietly, I realized I wanted to. I was no longer merely curious. I was captivated. Every interaction, every shared moment, was building a tension I didn't know how to release, a longing tempered by hesitation and respect. And in that delicate balance, I understood that the slow burn had truly begun. It was one of those rare, quiet evenings when the house felt almost empty, though it wasn't. My friend had gone upstairs to make a call, leaving just the two of us lingering near the small kitchen table. I had been nervously attempting to make conversation, but my words stumbled and fell flat, betraying the nervous energy I hadn't wanted to show. Then, without any fanfare, she leaned slightly closer, just enough that I felt her presence more keenly, and said softly, "You never really say what you mean, do you?" Her words were simple, almost teasing, yet they landed with unexpected weight. I swallowed, feeling my throat dry, my mind racing for something clever, something meaningful, anything that wouldn't reveal how completely flustered I was. But as I searched for words, I realized she wasn't expecting a grand confession. She wasn't impatient. She was patient, her eyes inviting me to speak without pressing, offering a quiet space in which I could exist fully. I began to talk. At first, it was halting, awkward. I spoke of small things, trivial frustrations, the mundanity of my day, but slowly, the walls I had built around my thoughts began to crumble. Her attention was steady, unwavering. She listened with a warmth that made my nervous words feel significant. Occasionally, her hand would hover near mine on the table, resting in a way that seemed accidental, yet lingered long enough for me to feel the brush of warmth. Every small gesture amplified the tension, a delicate balance between closeness and restraint. She never pressured me to reveal more than I wanted. Instead, she asked gentle, thoughtful questions, prompting me to explore my own feelings in ways I hadn't before. I noticed her leaning in slightly, the soft cadence of her voice, the way her hair fell just so over her shoulder. Each detail pulled me further into the quiet intimacy of the moment. It was strange, intoxicating to be this exposed and yet so safe at the same time. For the first time, I realized the depth of the tension between us. It wasn't a dramatic spark or an overtly romantic gesture. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, and yet it pressed on my chest like a soft but insistent weight. I felt acutely aware of her presence, of the warmth she radiated, the slight perfume in the air, the gentle rise and fall of her breathing as she listened. Every glance, every pause, every word was loaded with meaning I didn't fully understand but wanted desperately to explore. By the time the conversation faded naturally into a comfortable silence, I was aware of something profound. I had opened a door into my own vulnerability, and she had not only noticed but had welcomed me there. The connection wasn't declared, it wasn't shouted. It was quietly, powerfully felt. The slow burn between us had ignited further, fueled by patience, attentiveness, and the simple, potent act of listening. As I left that evening, my thoughts kept returning to her. Not just the way she looked, but the way she made me feel seen, safe, and, against all odds, understood. The spark had shifted into something deeper, something I knew would grow if given time. And I wanted to give it that time, even if it terrified me. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation, not exactly, but that evening carried a weight I hadn't expected. We were sitting on the small balcony outside her apartment, the city lights twinkling below, the night air cool against my skin. Conversation had started casually, an easy discussion about work, books, nothing particularly personal. But gradually, the words drifted into more fragile territory, revealing pieces of ourselves that weren't normally shared. I felt the tension first as a small knot in my stomach, the awareness that whatever I said next could change the dynamic between us. She had a way of listening that made you feel both exposed and entirely safe at once. I found myself speaking in ways I hadn't intended, about fears, regrets, moments of insecurity I usually kept hidden. Each confession was met not with judgment, but with a quiet attentiveness that made the space between us feel almost sacred. She reached out at one point, not in a commanding way, but softly, letting her hand rest near mine on the railing. I could feel the warmth radiating from her fingers even without direct contact. It was grounding, reassuring, as though she were silently telling me that it was okay to be seen exactly as I was. Her presence carried a calm authority that made vulnerability feel like something courageous rather than dangerous. For a while, neither of us spoke. We simply sat side by side, shoulders nearly touching, sharing the silence that spoke louder than words ever could. I noticed the way her hair caught the faint light from the street below, the gentle slope of her profile, the soft rhythm of her breathing. Everything about her in that moment was deliberate yet effortless. My pulse quickened, not from desire, exactly, but from the sheer intensity of being completely present with someone who seemed to understand without needing explanation. When I finally spoke again, it was quieter, more deliberate. I admitted feelings I hadn't fully acknowledged before. How much I valued these rare, unguarded moments, how unnerving and exhilarating it was to feel seen by her. She didn't respond immediately, only shifted slightly closer, her gaze steady, warm, and encouraging. The tension in my chest loosened slightly, replaced by a quiet exhilaration. It was the first time I truly understood the slow burn that had been building between us. Attraction wasn't just about looks or fleeting chemistry. It was about the way she made me want to be braver, to speak more honestly, to notice and care for the little things I usually overlooked in life. Every gesture she made, every glance, every pause in her words, reinforced the unspoken understanding growing between us. By the time we left the balcony, I felt a rare clarity. This wasn't a casual infatuation. It was a connection rooted in trust, emotional openness, and a shared willingness to risk discomfort for the sake of understanding. And though we hadn't crossed any physical boundary beyond small, safe gestures, the emotional intimacy alone was intoxicating. I walked away that night with a quiet certainty that this relationship, whatever shape it might take, was already transforming me. The slow burn had become undeniable, a gentle fire that promised warmth, intensity, and the potential for something far more profound than I had ever anticipated. The days that followed were deceptively ordinary, yet charged with something I couldn't name at first. Every interaction with her became a study in subtlety. We weren't overtly romantic, not yet, but the air between us seemed thicker, richer, as if every glance, every shared silence, carried a weight of unspoken meaning. One afternoon, we found ourselves at a local cafe, a corner table tucked near the window. The sunlight streamed through, warm and golden, catching the highlights in her hair. She leaned over the table slightly, pointing at a book I had brought, and I felt a shiver of awareness run through me. The brush of her hand against mine, brief and casual, but electric. It was as if the world had narrowed to just the two of us in that moment, the outside chatter fading into a soft blur. She laughed at something I said, a small, teasing laugh that made my chest tighten in the most unexpected way. I realized I was watching her hands, the tilt of her head, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners. More than I was listening to the words themselves. And she seemed aware. I could feel it in the way her gaze lingered just a moment too long, in the gentle tilt of her body toward mine, in the subtle warmth that radiated from her presence. Walking her to the bus stop later, our steps were naturally synchronized, almost as if the pace of our movements had been quietly negotiated. At one point, our hands brushed. Again, unintentional, but lingering just enough to make my pulse quicken. I caught a glimpse of her face, and there it was, that faint, knowing smile that had haunted my thoughts for weeks. I wanted to reach out, to let my fingers touch hers fully, but the hesitation, the respect, the fear of overstepping, held me back. And yet, the longing didn't vanish. It hummed quietly beneath the surface. In these small moments, I began to understand the power of subtlety. She didn't need grand gestures or dramatic confessions. The mere act of being close, of sharing space, of letting our presence brush against each other, was enough to build a tension that was almost tangible. Sitting near her on the sofa later that evening, our shoulders nearly touching, I noticed the softness of her sweater, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the warm air. I dared a glance at her face, and she returned it, steady, unflinching, as though silently saying, "Yes, I notice you too." That night, lying awake, I replayed every interaction. The brush of her hand, the warmth of her gaze, the small silences that somehow spoke volumes. I realized that the slow burn between us had reached a point where it no longer needed words to be felt. Every unspoken gesture, every subtle touch, every shared laugh had become its own language, a way of communicating feelings too fragile to voice outright. It was intoxicating and terrifying at the same time. I wanted to move closer, to shorten the distance between us, but the respect and hesitation remained, part of the charm, part of the tension. And in that delicate balance, I understood the true nature of what was building between us. A slow, simmering desire, tempered by awareness, patience, and an unspoken understanding that some connections needed time to burn perfectly. By the end of that evening, I knew one thing with certainty. The climax of this slow burn was approaching, and when it finally came, it would be powerful, deliberate, and entirely unforgettable. The evening had a softness to it that felt almost unreal, as if the world had shrunk to just the two of us. We were back at her apartment, the lights dimmed to a gentle glow, the faint hum of the city drifting in through the open window. All the tension that had quietly built between us over the past weeks, the lingering glances, the subtle touches, the slow-burning curiosity, was finally poised to find its resolution. We sat side by side on the sofa, our knees brushing, a subtle but undeniable closeness that had become second nature. She handed me a cup of tea, our fingers touching briefly as we exchanged it. The contact was fleeting, ordinary on the surface, yet electric beneath. I realized that every small gesture we had shared over the weeks, every hand on a shoulder, every accidental brush of fingers, every shared laugh, had been leading to this moment. A quiet acknowledgement of the connection we had nurtured. We talked, as we often did, about everything and nothing. But this time, there was a new openness in our conversation, a gentle willingness to reveal not just thoughts but feelings. I told her about how seeing her had shifted my perspective, how her presence had made me more aware of myself, more willing to face vulnerability. She listened with that calm attentiveness that had always drawn me in, her hand resting near mine on the sofa, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her. Then, without any dramatic preamble, she reached out and let her hand rest lightly over mine. The gesture was simple, yet it carried everything words could not. The slow burn that had simmered for weeks, the curiosity, the hesitation, the fascination, found its first real expression in that quiet, steady contact. I could feel her fingers relax over mine, her warmth grounding me, her presence speaking volumes. Our conversation faded into a comfortable silence. I turned slightly toward her, drawn by a quiet impulse, and she tilted her head just enough to meet my gaze. There was a long pause, a moment that felt suspended in time. Then she smiled, a soft, knowing smile, the same one that had haunted my thoughts since the first evening. And in that smile, I saw everything: recognition, curiosity, and the gentle acceptance of what had quietly grown between us. We didn't need to speak. I reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, and she leaned in just slightly, her cheek brushing mine. It was delicate, fleeting, yet utterly profound. A YouTube-safe moment that conveyed intimacy, trust, and mutual affection without a single word. For the first time in weeks, I felt completely seen. And I knew, without doubt, that whatever this connection had become, it was real. We could have declared it, labeled it, or rushed into it. But the slow burn had taught us something more valuable: patience, attentiveness, and the beauty of letting intimacy grow naturally. As I left that night, I glanced back at her one last time. She was standing by the window, a faint smile lingering on her lips. I knew this wasn't the end of our story. It was the beginning of something deeper, something deliberate, something profoundly human. The spark that had started in silence had matured into a quiet flame, steady, warm, and ready to endure. And in that moment, I realized that slow-burn romance wasn't about rushing to a climax. It was about savoring every glance, every touch, every fleeting moment until it became unforgettable. If this story of quiet glances, subtle touches, and a slow-burning connection moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a heartfelt romance. Don't forget to subscribe for more age gap love stories that linger in the heart long after the video ends.